Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our discussion this morning with Sean Perryman of the NAACP. We're going to let a few more people jump on the call right now. Give people a few moments to do that. But while we're doing that, I wanted to make just a few announcements. First is just a reminder that DemBiz recently launched a brand new website. You can learn more about the organization and become a member at dembiz.org. That's DEMBIZ.org. And as many of you know, DemBiz is an all-volunteer organization, and it does require some support for us to keep this programming going, even during this COVID-19 crisis where we're not doing in-person events like we normally would be doing. So your support is greatly appreciated. And we have 3 different membership levels, and I'd like to recognize our great benefactor, Carlos Del Toro, for his longtime support of DemBiz, and we encourage you to join us, help us move the business community forward, and make great business connections as well. So that being said, folks are jumping on, and I guess we can get right into it. This morning we are very pleased to be joined by Sean Perryman, who is the president of the Fairfax County chapter of the NAACP. His day job is as the Director of Social Impact Policy and Counsel at the Internet Association. He also served as a counsel for the House Oversight Committee and practiced civil litigation in both Texas and the District of Columbia. Sean, good morning and welcome to DemBiz. How are you?
Morning, Chris. Thank you for having me. I'm pleased to be here.
Well, I know you're making the rounds quite a bit these days. It's a very incredible moment that we're living through. And just to give folks an idea of how this will go, it'll be typical of our webinars, which is I've got some questions for Sean, and then we'll get into some audience questions. If you have a question, you can click on the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Go ahead and type that in, and I'll be choosing those as we move through this hour. So want to start with just this moment, and how is it different in your view? Because we're seeing some incredible changes to monuments and school names and flags and everything like that. How is this different and why?
Yeah, I've grappled with that for the last few weeks to figure out how is it different. I mean, it certainly feels different to me, and when I speak to some of the older folks that have been in this longer, they feel like it's a different moment as well. I think it's different in the sense that the nation is kind of singularly focused on one thing at a time. We don't have the sports to distract us. At the beginning of this, we were all kind of in the house together, and you had to sort of face both the data that we were seeing as well as the violent images that we were seeing. It didn't help that a lot of the responses to protests to police brutality were met with more police brutality. So I think all of that factors into it. But I also look at some of the calls to action at these different protests, and it's sort of like, white silence is violence. It's calling on anti-racism. It's calling on white people to do more. Whereas before, if you look at the civil rights era, it was more, I am a man, declarative of, give me rights. Now it's like, you need to take part in this and reconcile with your own actions in this. And I think that's why we're seeing some of the name changes and different things. I think as a nation, we're being more reflective on what this actually means and what messages we're sending by having these symbols and flags everywhere.
And how is the NAACP, particularly your chapter, trying to use this moment to kind of spring forward with regard to progress?
Yeah, we're doing it in a couple different ways. We've already been in this fight, obviously, and as it pertained to the name changes, we were on the front lines of that, so we're happy to see that those things move forward. But we're very cognizant of these are symbolic changes, and we want substantive changes. So the other thing we've been working on is police reform. We put out a package of 8 things, not to confuse with 8 can't wait. We could do better than that. But we put out a package of 8 things that need to change in Fairfax that we think will make it more equitable, will insert transparency and accountability. And I think it's important to say it's not about trying to indict all the police, that all the police are bad. This is a government function like any other, and we want transparency and accountability, and we don't have it in the same way that we have it for other government functions, just by the nature of the union contracts, by the way that we've treated the police before. But we know that the way Black people are policed, both locally, statewide, and nationally, has shown to be different than how other people are policed.
Right. And that actually leads into a question that we got beforehand via email from Renee Lawrence, who was asking about 911 calls and emergency response and the possibility of separating those, into categories of serious and less serious, because we're seeing some of these police brutality incidents in response to very minor infractions. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And I think that goes to what we were saying that, when we really look at what's happening, we're asking the police to do too much. We're asking them to be counselors, we're asking them to be, social services, friends to be, it's too much. So I think there needs to be a reexamination, not of policing, but of public safety. One of the things that we're looking here at the county, working with the Board of Supervisors, to look at other models for how we can change how we respond to emergencies. So Portland has an interesting model where they triage the different 911 calls differently so that you have an unarmed response team. So that way they're coming and they have a different skill set than a man with a gun and a stun gun. And we have to keep in mind, you're giving these people these tools, the stun guns, batons, they're going out there, they're going to use them, right? So it's changing the mindset that not every emergency needs to be met with force or violence.
Right, and you might have said it, or somebody recently said it, that if you see everybody as nails, you see yourself as a hammer, or something to that effect. Where
if all you have is a hammer and everything else looks like a nail. Yeah,
that's right. That's right. You're better explaining that than I am. So, wanted to ask you also about. You mentioned earlier that a lot of people want to help. There are well-meaning people that don't think of themselves as being a problem. They are progressive in their thought process. They have African-American friends. Maybe they're members of organizations that are progressive along those lines also. But maybe the dots aren't quite connecting in terms of what the Black experience really is, how deeply ingrained these problems really are. What is your sense of the best way to reach a mutual understanding on issues like that?
Yeah, and I understand that that's difficult, right? Like if you've had one lived experience, it's very hard for you to say, well, wait, someone else out here is having a completely separate experience than I am. And we have to understand when it comes to institutions like the police and that Black people often have a very different lived experience. So I think for those people, it's accepting that that's true, accepting that even if you have Black friends and that you're well-intentioned, that you may be racist in some ways. And that's very hard for people to understand. And I always express this in this way that even Black people have an anti-Black racism in some ways, right? As a society, we have had these symbols and these messages that, of white supremacy and anti-Black racism throughout, whether we are aware of it or not. We can go back to the Jane Elliott experiments with the dolls, right? You've and people in business should understand this. You've absorbed these signals and symbols without even knowing it, and you're walking around and you may be acting on those in ways that you don't understand. So I think it's the acknowledgement that yes, I can have Black friends and whatever, and I may have unintentional biases. And I think it's also understanding that there are different lived experiences, and it's also education. People want to get in this fight and understand this. You have to know the data. You have to know the people who have already been working on this. I always tell people, don't believe me. Look at the data. I can show you where to go, and then you make your own conclusion. Because that's an important element of it, that we understand what we're facing here, have a real recognition of it, and then try to address it and follow those who are already doing the work.
And what have you found actually changes somebody's mind? Let's say somebody's open to it, they're receptive to learning. What points, what logic changes minds in your experience?
That's a tough one. If someone is open to it, it's usually, a real genuine effort on their own part to educate themselves, right? Being open to it, introducing, some literature to them and letting them read something, and then sort of like, well, wait a second, that doesn't make sense. Or just presenting them with an argument in a way they may not have thought of. One of the most effective things for me, I never really believed in the death penalty because of the disproportionate rate of it. Maybe in theory I could understand it, but in practice it seemed wrong. But I heard Brian Stevenson speak about it, and it was in such a way that it rethought how I thought, and I always present this argument to people. He said if the German state today had the death penalty still, and the people that they were giving the death penalty to were disproportionately Jewish people, we would not only be suspicious, we would also say they don't have the legitimacy to do that. But here in America, we understand the long history of Black Americans in this country, and we see these disproportionate use of the death penalty. We see the sentencing that's drastically different for the same crimes, and we don't question whether there's something fundamentally wrong with that system and whether they have the legitimacy to do things like the death penalty. So it's just an interesting concept, and I think it's just having these conversations is an important part of it.
Right, and part of that system is what has come to be referred to as the school to prison pipeline. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, the school to prison pipeline. You know, in the 70s, we did not have as many police officers in schools as we do today. And part of this is a response to school shootings. And the school shootings, they keep happening. I mean, before the pandemic, it was every week. We all know we'd read about a school shooting, maybe multiple school shootings in a week. So the police and the schools didn't, according to all the data, never really showed any ability to stop the school shootings, but we still kept them there. And the result of that was that the police were now ingrained into the school process, and problems that would normally be handled as administrative became criminal. So we see, even in the disciplinary with administrative discipline, Black, Latinx, and disabled students often are disciplined harsher than white students who don't have disabilities and everything else. So we see that disparity there, but it's even more troubling because now with the introduction of the officer, we're not preventing school shootings, but we're seeing an increasing number of arrests at schools where now you've arrested the student, even if it's not a very serious charge, that follows them. They're now, that's why they call it school to prison pipeline. They are now in the system. The slightest thing, they can be put back in the system for parole violation, anything. And the interesting thing is it was happening locally. And probably one of my least favorite towns here, Herndon. I had an issue with Herndon yesterday, I'm joking, but it was happening in Herndon, in the Herndon Middle School, and we were seeing these arrests, and it was shocking because it was happening at Herndon Middle School, right? And these kids were being arrested for disorderly conduct. So once we were able to change the MOU between the schools and the police, and they couldn't arrest for that, and it made it harder to interact, we saw a 60% drop in arrests in 1 year. And then this is the second year, we now see a 40% drop in arrests. And we still see the same disproportionate arrests of Black and Latinx students, but it's far, far fewer. So all of that is part of the school to prison pipeline. We put something there thinking, well-intentioned, thinking this is good public policy. We have a cop here, no one's gonna get hurt. And what's happening is there are people being hurt, but we're not seeing it in the same way that we were expecting.
And you just mentioned Brian Stevenson, and I think a lot of people are now getting exposed to movies like Just Mercy and the documentary 13th, and he was featured in both of those and spoke very eloquently about the prison system and particularly the profit motive in our current prison system, which is so ridiculous. And is something that just sort of embeds it deeper and deeper into society. Do you see that part of it changing anytime soon?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a hard one. I think, you know, we have private prisons, obviously, that are making money off of prisoners and whatever. But I think it's important for people listening to understand that this isn't a new concept. From the time that slavery was abolished, they immediately went into convict leasing. So there was always this idea of, and I always tell people when we think about Juneteenth and the freedoms and stuff, that really Juneteenth marks the time everyone learned about liberation, but it also starts the essentially ever-present struggle for freedom, for true freedom, because they're trying to find new ways to lock these people up and continue to profit off of them. So we see that now with our prisoners here, and I think we need to re-examine that too. We keep people in prison for far longer than we know we have to, because we don't see the recidivism after a certain age. We have a number of people locked up in Virginia for marijuana crimes that don't need to be locked up. And then here's the new added part of this is COVID has sort of exposed that we were locking people up that we don't need to as well. And of course, I'm talking about jails and prisons, but jails, they let go 50% of that population in Fairfax overnight. They let them all go because of COVID. And we didn't see a spike in crime. There wasn't no, a crime spree somewhere. So a lot of people are jailed because they can't afford bail, and they may not be a threat to society, and we keep them jailed. So I think we need to re-examine all these things in light of this new reality we're in.
Okay, and of course that's one reason that elections matter, right? I mean, you've got
Right.
that's a policy issue, and you need people who are elected officials who are caring about that for one thing and are willing to act on it. Want to get into another policy question that we got from Phil Najowski Eichner. Phil, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Wanted to hear Sean's views regarding the county's implementation of the recommendations of the Ad Hoc Police Practices Review Commission and what additional reforms are needed.
Yeah, I think, and I don't know every part of that ad hoc commission, but I think he's referring to the 2015 ad hoc commission. The county has really delayed implementing the recommendations of that commission. Part of that was they were supposed to provide demographic data, both on arrests, citations, pretty much any aspect of policing, stops, frisks, broken down by both district, race, gender, etc. And they haven't provided it since 2015. And that was one of the things that we have been advocating for starting this year, saying, where's the data? And, you know, they said the vendor fell through, the dog ate their homework, everything. I'm happy to announce in the last 2 weeks, we were very successful, and the chief is providing that data as of yesterday. He started publishing it. There's still more aspects of it, but they're starting to be published. So I think that is a critical component to understanding how people are being policed and whether we're policing them fairly, because use of force doesn't give the full picture, even though our use of force numbers are bad. And I think other than that, that's the kind of part of the commission I've always been focused on, the data. But the use of force policy here in Fairfax County actually isn't bad. It's actually a very good one relative to the surrounding counties, but the use of force data is very troubling.
Okay. And I want to remind folks who are tuning in that if you have a question for Sean, you can click on the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen, and I'll be choosing those as we move through. Sean, I want to ask you about your experience as an African-American man. You know, that is, we talked about people trying to understand, and I think there's a real empathy gap in many different directions in our society. Clearly, this is one of them. Talk a little bit about, if you could, your experience with the police, with the education system, with the business community, which we'll get to in just a few minutes. What do people maybe not understand, or what stands out about your own experience?
I think the best way to explain my own experience is to talk about privilege. And sometimes when you talk about privilege, people assume you mean money, and they're saying, oh, I work very hard, they get very defensive. The idea of privilege is one that you don't have to worry about certain things. Like, you don't have to, there's certain things that are just, you could take for granted. For instance, there are Black women who have to do their hair a certain way because if they came in, the employer may not hire them or may not like that. There are aspects of privilege where you simply do not have to think about certain things, right? I'll give my experience. I was a lawyer in Dallas, Texas. I worked at a very large firm. I was one of 2 African Americans in the entire firm. The rest
Out of
was
how many?
white. 500.
Okay.
So 500. Well, 500 in the whole firm, but then it was 200 based in Dallas, so 225, and I was one of 2. So we were frequently.
You were in the minority, let's put it that way.
Yeah. But there was very much a stigma attached to that, because as one of the only African Americans, I understood, and I don't think this is too far off because I've talked to partners about this since. If I didn't perform, they may think twice before hiring another Black summer associate. There's never a situation where Chris or someone's expecting you to be the representative for the white race or anything else, right? So you kind of carry that around. And then also there's the element of when things happen, you don't know, is this being done because of my race or is this done for some other reason? So this sort of that psychic weight of that you may be seen as threatening or whatever. I'm very cognizant of the fact if I get on an elevator and there's one white woman on there, I'm very aware of what I look like, and I'm like, I'm trying to signal that I am not a threat, right? So there may be people who don't experience that, and so there's that. I remember in the education system, I was either seen as sort of an anomaly, or I was like looked at with fascination, or I was looked at as you know, dismissed because, you know, I remember going to my counselor in high school and he'd say, well, you know, maybe you can go to junior college. And you know, I'm the first one in my family to go to college and law school, and I went to a pretty good law school and everything else.
Sure.
So it was, but it was, he just said that to me. It wasn't like, that was his assumption of what my capability was. So there are those things that happen. You sort of, you're very cognizant you're a representative of the race in some ways, in some places where you're not, where you're the only person. But then I also tell the story of when we talk about privilege, if you have a child, you are not worried that they will learn about history that looks like, that people that look like them. You're not worried that they won't have a concept of their contribution to American history. Mm-hmm. Black parents actively have to make sure that is done. You don't have to worry that when you turn on TV, they won't see people that look like them. This is something that we have to like seek out. So it's just these kind of defaults of having that experience and knowing that. And that's what I say with this whole police violence thing. It's maddening in a way because it's not like the 1960s where it was codified. If I went to a store, they're not going to let me in. It's more insidious than that. So I have to first prove to everyone, this has happened to me, hope that they believe me, and then get some sort of justice. So it's a interesting experience. And I think that's what we're seeing bubble up during this time.
And it has occurred to me through this process that as a white guy, I walk out the door and I expend zero mental energy on exactly what you're talking about, you know. Mm-hmm. And what you're talking about reminds me of both Barack and Michelle Obama as well. You know, hearing Michelle Obama talk about her high school counselor saying she wasn't Princeton material, and also President Obama having to really do it that much better than the other guy because he was setting an example and people were looking to him, looking to see his performance, and he knew that he had to come through. So it's interesting that you mentioned those things. Yeah. You know, I've also got some friends who have shared similar experiences regarding elevators, and it's almost like it's at the point where they sort of joke around amongst each other in a wry kind of way that they know they're going to be pulled over at some point. They know that they are going to be asked certain questions. So it's always eye-opening to see and hear things like that. I want to get back to what you were talking about just a second ago with some of those stats. Catherine Tobin is asking, how would we find or see the published data you're talking about?
Oh, so the new data, I have to get back to you on that because that literally just came out this week, and they sent us a copy. But as far as the website, I'm not sure if it's up yet. It should be though. I just don't have the link off the top of my head of what it's under. But I can send that back to you, Chris, where you can get that. But as far as the use of force data, that's available. They put out their annual report last week. You could probably just type in use of force on Google, use of force Fairfax County. What it found was that African Americans make up around 9.5% of the county, but we account for nearly 50% of use of force. I believe the exact number is 45%. So there's huge disproportionate use of force on the Black population here. And I want to be, you know, I never want to mislead anyone. The use of force incidents aren't dramatically huge throughout Fairfax. It's not something that's happening every day. Mm-hmm. I think there's somewhere around the neighborhood of 500 to 600 uses of force in a year, which is significant. But those are nearly 45% of those are Black people, or 45% of those are Black people who live here in Fairfax.
Okay. Well, we're certainly going to get back to policing and the African American experience. I want to transition just a little bit here, though, and get to a question from our fantastic immediate past president, Lori McNamara, who asks, how can the business community best support you in your objectives?
Yeah, I think the business community can be a great partner in a lot of ways, right? Because I think, you know, Fairfax NAACP has been here for 102 years in this community now, right? And we do have a voice here and we're respected, but we're seen as this is our issue. But if the business community lends its voice to this issue, it becomes greater, right? Like, oh, everyone cares about this. So if they say, look, this use of force incidents are unacceptable. It's unacceptable that I have my business on Robert E. Lee Highway, right? What kind of message are we sending here? I think that perks up the ears of politicians. So I think they can do that. But then I think they can also be introspective and how can I have practices that are more anti-racist? How can I invite more people in and let them know that this is an inclusive environment? I think these are all ways the business community can get involved, but use your voice. Politicians listen to you. They respect what you have to say. And if you start getting involved in this issue, I think it will help that cause.
Well, and a lot of people, we mentioned earlier, a lot of people are wondering how they can help. And the problem is it runs deep, it's very broad, it can be a little bit overwhelming. And I think that if people are wondering, to me, business seems like not a low-hanging fruit, but an easier way and a more concrete way to move the ball up the court, because you can provide an opportunity, you can just be fair about basic things like lending money, access to capital, hiring, those types of things, because so much of this is based in opportunity or lack thereof, as far as, it seems to me. So just those basic things, and recognizing the value of not only African-American businesses, but Indian businesses and Jewish businesses and all these things that sort of enhance the fabric of our communities. Have you seen any sense that the business community is positively responding to its obligations / potential to help here?
Yeah, I actually do. I mean, I'm having this conversation with you. I've had this conversation with the Vienna Business Association. After that, actually, one of them helped me create a website. She was like, you can consult on anti-racism because they wanted help with this. But we talked about things like blind hiring, right? Like we have these biases where we see someone and it may not be malicious. It may be, you see someone and it's like, oh, he reminds me of a young Chris. But then when you look around and your whole establishment is young Chris's and there's no one else, right?
Right.
So it's being more intentional and making sure you're trying to get your biases out of the hiring process, thinking about promotions, because we know that men, especially white men, are more likely to say, hey, I want more money. And you may have someone there who deserves it just as much, but they don't speak up. And that could be cultural and everything else. So it's trying to making sure your business makes decisions in objective ways so that you are promoting and hiring and doing all these things in a diverse way. And then also looking at your footprint in the sense of, if you're in a location that geographically maybe you can't hire as diversely as you'd like, what about your vendors, right? Where are you getting your vendors from? Where are you thinking about that and like how you can support those businesses? So these are all just ways that you can have an impact in your community in a small way, but it's meaningful.
And this does run so deep, because opportunity is really, in my view, it is the central thing about this country that is really fantastic, and it's got to be more evenly spread. You and I talked on the phone a couple days ago about a video clip from Martin Luther King Jr. where he talked about land and the fact that it was given, especially in the West and the Midwest, to white people as a way to give them kind of an economic floor from which they could grow their wealth and grow their opportunities. And that was followed up with land grant colleges and low interest loans and training and all the rest. And it is an incredible foundation with which to build, but which the African American community has not been the beneficiary of. Can you talk about that, and also land as it pertains to the Fairfax County chapter?
Yeah, sure. So, and this is an interesting point. When I talk about white privilege, I talk about the sort of attitude things that we talked about earlier, but then I always talk about there were codified white privileges in the sense that you had the Homestead Act, where you gave people this free land. You had the GI Bill, which Black people were routinely locked out of, so they couldn't get the mortgages to build that sort of wealth that we've seen, and how that affects people, how you can mortgage those houses and that land to build more wealth, build more education. You look at the history of Black Americans in this country, and sometimes we talk about reparations and people say, well, slavery was so long ago. It's like reparations is not only just that. In Chicago alone, just through unfair leasing of houses, mortgaging of houses, there was a study last year that showed that they stole about $4 billion worth of wealth from Black people in Chicago in the 1960s and 70s. So, I mean, there are multiple instances of white people being given grants, given land, and Black people being actively taken away the nation now is collectively learning about Black Wall Street, where you had a very prosperous Black community who was firebombed by, in a race riot. So you have these things throughout history, and it translates into generational wealth. Like I tell you, I'm the first person in my family to go to college. Well, that was because my mom grew up in South Carolina. My mother, who's still alive, grew up in South Carolina, where there were segregated schools. There was no possibility of going to college. It wasn't conceivable. So we're only one generation in where that was a possibility, right? So if you think about it in that context, it shows you kind of the ramifications of not having the opportunity available. And to your point about Fairfax County NAACP, we trace our history. The Fairfax chapter was started in 1944, but we trace our history to 1918, where in Falls Church, E.B. Henderson started the Fairfax chapter of the NAACP, primarily because a lot of land in Falls Church was taken away from Black families there. And at the time, the national NAACP didn't want to let him chapter that there because it was considered too dangerous, too rural a community, and that they surely wouldn't survive, literally wouldn't survive. Mm-hmm. So that's the history here in Fairfax. So it's there are many instances of this throughout history, and we have to kind of reflect on what is the impact of that for generations, all that wealth that was stolen. And
you mentioned your mom. Who was your role model? I think that I mentioned to you on the phone again a couple of days ago that I watched an interview with Charles Barkley where he went to a school and he said, what do you want to do with your life? And he said 90% of the African-American kids said they wanted to be an athlete or an entertainer, and only 10% of the white kids wanted to do that. They wanted to be doctors or lawyers or whatever. So who was your role model, and what do you see as the importance of that in moving toward progress on this?
It's a great question. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and my role model, I think, has shifted from time to time over the years. And it also goes to what you're saying about who you're exposed to. In my time, my grandfather was a big role model for me because he was an immigrant from Barbados. His mother died when he was 7, and he immigrated over here at 16, just, made a life for himself. So I found that very inspiring. But he was a working class guy. He had, worked a 9 to 5 or more, and was able to, at that time, homes were affordable, and he could buy a house and eventually have a family and do all that. As I got older, it's funny to me, and this may sound funny to people, Jay-Z was a big role model for me because he grew up in the neighborhood over in Brooklyn, and he was this huge rapper. I loved him, and he was a big success. But these were the people that was like the concept of wealth and becoming that big from this part of Brooklyn. And then as I got even in my adult years, I would say my role model was Congressman Elijah Cummings, who I worked for. Mm-hmm. So it's about who you're exposed to and what you see, but it also, I think, determines what you view as possible. What is the reality and what are the lanes that you can achieve that?
Well, it's also important to, it really can't be overstated, the importance of seeing a role model that looks like you. And even short of being a role model, just seeing people in positions of authority and of consequence that look like you. I was watching this medical documentary. My wife's a med student, so I get subjected to a lot of these things. But this follows a hospital called Lenox Hill, New York City. And a lot of these African-American patients or Hispanic patients, it's a bunch of white doctors that walk in the room. And naturally, that is something that will be noticed, and I think that it trickles on down the line where the care, your perception of the care you're receiving is impacted. We've mentioned the business community and the importance of having some diversity and having being exposed as a society to these different things. So it seems like role models are just critical, and the more opportunities that are provided, the more role models will be created as well.
Yeah, agreed with that. And it's needed. It's something. One of the transformational things for me as a kid was taking this thing called Junior Achievement, where it just talked to you about how to interview, how to come into a room and shake everyone's hand and do that sort of thing. I didn't have anyone in my family who worked in a business community who understood those soft skills like that.
Right.
And I think people take that for granted. It's not that kids don't want to do it or whatever. They may never have had someone who said, this is how you conduct yourself. As simple as that. So I think we take a lot of those things for granted. But I do want to say about the medical community, since you mentioned this, you know, I don't want to be someone who always like talks about, oh, racism is bad, because it is bad. But I don't think we can really understand history and shape policy in this country without an understanding of race. Everything from where you build a highway, right? Why is that highway built there? Oh, they built it through a Black community. That's a lot of the times where what they'll choose, right? So understanding how the highway systems, how this was built, it's usually there's something, you really cannot get a full picture of America without understanding, good understanding of race. And then what you were saying about the healthcare industry with the perceptions of doctors, it's not only the lack of diversity, it's the history there. My mother grew up in, like I said, South Carolina. They very, you know, it's very distinct in her mind, it's a Tuskegee experiment. That there are doctors and white doctors, and growing as a child, there are white doctors who are not interested in your health. And in fact, they may want to experiment on you in some way. And so this is not born out of paranoia. This is a lived experience that people that she knew those people. And so they have ingrained that I need to be very skeptical of these doctors who do not look like me and who may not care that much about me. And it's how do you get past that history? So I think that's an important thing for us to understand, and important reason why even in professions, even if you're not a diverse person, you need to understand that history.
Right, that makes sense. All right, I want to get to a couple questions here. Our former 2nd District Congressman Glenn Nye chiming in with a question here. You described an experience of the burden of managing white fear toward you. How can we all help to reduce this friction in our society that stresses relationships and puts undue burden on our Black neighbors?
Yeah, I think with that, if you are the white person, maybe just smiling and letting people know you're not like that, and you can kind of disarm a situation, right? Or if you see something like that, sometimes we've all seen instances where people are being treated unfairly. Speak up, right? Like if you're just watching this, it's hard to distinguish someone who is a spectator versus someone who's in the mob, right? Like if they're just watching you being treated unfairly or something like that, or that you get on a person, someone clutches their purse and they see that and they say nothing, like you're part of that crowd now. You've essentially joined in with them. So speaking up in those situations, I think, is critical.
And there's a lot of power in that. You know, we each have some amount of power, and there is a lot to be said for using that for the greater good. Going to be jumping around just a little bit because these questions are covering a range of topics. So this is another policy question. This is from John Cartmill in Herndon, mentioned earlier. What are some policies you are working on to address inequities in healthcare and environmental justice?
Yeah, so right now we've been super focused on police reform and school reform, but in healthcare, we were very vocal at the beginning of COVID of having certain mandatory requirements for mask wearing, of paid sick leave, so that we have people who can, if they're sick, they don't feel required or obligated to come into work. That's really been our focus, has been pandemic related, trying to make it more equitable so that it's not a bunch of service workers who are primarily Black and brown serving unmasked white people and getting sick. So that has been one of our healthcare focus. At the environmental level, the state NAACP is very active in Union Hill and filing lawsuits and doing that sort of thing to make sure that the environmental, like we said, you can't understand America without understanding racism. When you look at where they build these charging stations and everything else, they're historically Black communities. And even the Trump administration has put out an EPA report that says environmental justice is needed because we're building these things and we're polluting in higher levels in Black communities. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of been the involvement with environmental justice.
Okay. And we also got just a comment. We were talking earlier about what is taught in schools. And one of our great board members, Jim Dyke, who is a former Virginia Secretary of Education, made this comment that privilege is having your history as part of the core curriculum, right, and my history as an elective. So that kind of illustrates the difference right there.
Right.
Uh, Also, a question from RJ Narang, our president-elect, also one of our board members, he wants to know, how do we keep this energy up? How do we hold legislators accountable in making real reform, both those that have spoken up and those that have not?
That's the key, right? In Fairfax County, I think the policymakers try to kill things via committee. Let's form a task force, wear everyone out, and then it'll die and we'll go back to business as usual. I think this is self-serving in some ways, right? I tell people join the NAACP because we're going to be in this fight after people long forget about it.
You're allowed to plug the organization on this. You're good.
But that way you can keep up with what's going on, and we put out calls to action, and you can keep up with that without having to try to do it all yourself. But I think it's also making very clear statements, writing letters, calling your representatives, the elected officials, and saying, like, this is what I want to see. This is what I want to see, and this is when I want to see it, and this is when, and if you don't support this, I won't support you. That is the tricky part. And I know this is the DemBiz, so I'll say this. You cannot just support people because they are Democrats, and the D alone is enough. We can't continue with that, because what we have to understand here in Fairfax County, we're seeing these disproportionate outcomes. We are all mostly democratically controlled county. This is not all Pat Harity doing this, right? Mm-hmm. So we have to hold these Democrats accountable. And everywhere I've gone, I've talked about Sheriff Kincaid, who's a Democrat, who's allowed, in March of this year, there was a sexual assault at the jail. A sheriff's deputy assaulted an inmate, a female inmate. The same deputy has killed 2 people prior to this, including Natasha McKenna, who he stun gunned to death. Mm. This is a Democratic sheriff that had this guy here and had never held him accountable before. We cannot allow that. So if you want to stay on these people and doing this thing, it has to be, your loyalty cannot be purely to whoever the Democrat is. It has to be calling on them to do something very specific. Black lives have to matter all the time, not when they're killed in the street, not when it's a Republican. It has to matter all the time.
Okay. Again, we talked a few days ago, and you've done so many of these interviews, and I asked, what hasn't been covered that you think is really relevant? And you had mentioned the potential for President Trump to get reelected. And that at this unique moment, when people are protesting and people are energized, that could create a particular dynamic. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I've talked about this, and it's just more, I've spoken to friends about this, but it's something that's been on my mind a lot lately, because I see people say the sort of fear of President Trump won't leave office if he loses, and what would that mean and how disastrous that would be. And it's been curious to me, because I don't think that's a real risk, in the sense that if he loses, Joe Biden is sworn in, I don't think that the army is going to stop Joe Biden from entering the White House. They're going to say, please leave. Trump will say that the election was fraud, and he'll do what he does.
Sure.
What I think is the real risk here, when I see this, when I look into the streets and I see the riots in the streets, and we have to remember they have not stopped. The protesting, the police violence, none of that has stopped. In Richmond, this is going on well past 30 days now. What I see is that we are trying to energize those people to go vote and to organize and vote and get President Trump out of office. That's what people are trying to do. If they go vote and Trump wins in the same way that he won in 2016, meaning he wins the Electoral College but loses a large part of the popular vote, I think that will be the most destabilizing thing that could happen to America, because people have essentially seen that even if we have the numbers, we cannot get him out of office legitimately. So what does that leave them with? We have, and you also have to keep in mind, we have a pandemic, we have close to 50 million people unemployed, and now you're telling them that the legitimate election where they won the popular vote doesn't count because we have this crazy electoral college system. These are people who've already been conditioned, we have seen it in 50 states now, to go out to the streets and protest. I think if he wins in that manner, I worry about what the stability of the country, what will happen, because I think these people are used to protesting now. They're unemployed, their prospects don't look good, and now they've won an election by the way that most people consider winning, and then they still get no recourse, no sense of change.
Well, that would be a very dangerous situation, I agree, and hopefully it doesn't come to that. You mentioned Joe Biden. Do you have, is there a vice presidential pick that you think would be particularly energizing to the African-American community?
I don't know. Of the, and you know, I can't speak for everyone, but I don't know. I don't see any of the common picks to, they all have some kind of flaw, especially I think Kamala Harris and everything else. But I also think maybe Stacey Abrams would satisfy some people. I think it would surprise you. My personal pick that would energize me would be Elizabeth Warren. I think just politically and policy-wise, that would be a big statement from him.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think there's a particular African-American pick that would energize anyone. I think it would be a nod in the right direction, regardless if it was a Black woman who was picked.
Mm-hmm.
But I think they all have their issues. And so I'm not sure if there would be one who would be, you know, oh, now everyone's going to be on board. Maybe Michelle Obama, but I don't think she's in contention.
Are there any that make you more nervous than others that are being discussed?
Of the people being discussed, no, not particularly. Amy Klobuchar was making me very nervous, but now she's not being considered. But that would have been disastrous if she was picked. Outside of that, no, I don't think there's one that makes me particular. Well, maybe Val Demings. I've heard her name thrown around, and she's a former police officer, and I think he's thinking in a certain way. But I think it would be a very risky choice.
You mean because of her background as a police officer?
I think because of her background as a police officer in this moment, and then I also think I don't know if well, I'm very familiar with her. I think she's, you know, a good congressperson, but I don't think she has a name recognition of a Kamala Harris or a Stacey Abrams at this point. So it would be a very unusual pick, and then I think both the lack of name recognition and also the scrutiny of her past would be interesting to see.
Okay. Yeah, name ID is just so critical, or star power, or whatever you want to call it. I think I've always felt that people need to be energized and feel good about the overall ticket, and it has to be somebody that people perceive to be ready to step into the top job right away, especially with a candidate of advanced age, like Vice President Biden. Want to step back and zoom out a little bit. We talked about the Black experience earlier. Where does the African-American community find hope? What is, as you look forward, this is, you know, people talk about slavery happened all these for so long, and we're 150 years past the Civil War, and we're still having these problems. We still see these institutional disparities. Where's the hope?
That's a good question. I think that I at least find hope in the sense of I've never heard the conversations we are having now, in the sense of, you know, you get, and I'll be completely candid. I've been very involved in the name changing, for instance, right? Because I realized that this was such a critical component of, like, you don't even have a concept of how bad this is, that you need to do it. But at the same time, I always felt like, I wish I didn't have to waste my time on that. That should be a no-brainer. That shouldn't be there, right? So I think that the no-brainer stuff is happening now, right? It's just happening on its own, that people are like, this is terrible, we can't do this. Now we can get into the substantive policy stuff, and I've seen people open to that discussion where the chief of police and everyone else is saying, we need to address this use of force issue. We need to address the data issue. How do we better equip the police? And I know defund the police is a controversial term, but the fact that we're having that conversation as a country, even if people, you know, don't agree with the marketing of it or whatever, you're having that discussion of what are the best uses of our resources to make us all safe. I think these are really critical conversations, and we're talking about taking the SROs out of schools, and people are receptive to that. So I think all of these conversations give me hope, and they've been more sustained than I've ever seen before. So I'm hopeful in that sense. But, you know, it requires work. You know, they say what's the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice. I always say you have to bend it towards justice, right? We have to collectively work together to make these things happen, because they're not going to happen out of people's good conscience or shame or whatever else. It's people advocating and forcing these things to happen that have made it happen traditionally.
Well, and that bending often runs into a lot of active resistance as well. So
Right.
that's a challenge. We talked earlier about, and you just touched on it again, reaching mutual understanding among peoples, not just black and white, but of different religions and geographies and so on and so forth. We talked on the phone a couple of days ago about my grandfather, who was a very intelligent man. He grew up in Baltimore, got a job at North American Aviation during World War II as an engineer, and oversaw something like 300 engineers and was instrumental in the engineering of the P-51 Mustang, which obviously helped us win the war. He was backward in some of his views. And he asked me one time, what, he looked at the national holidays that we have. We've got Lincoln's birthday, we've got Columbus Day even, we've got this and that. And he asked me, why does Martin Luther King Jr. deserve a holiday? And I gave him my own answer, obviously. But how would you, for people like that who just aren't quite getting it on that historical level, how would you answer that question?
Why he deserves a holiday, or? I think that Martin Luther King Jr. Essentially made people realize the horrors that were going on nationwide and the culpability of the government in those in ways that maybe they hadn't appreciated before. And I think, he was a brilliant man. And I think we talked about this, the no-brainers of the world. I always think this may be too abstract, but I always think it is such a travesty that a man that was that brilliant, who, got his PhD at such a young age and did all these things, had to trouble himself with making people understand that because you had more melanin in your skin, you should be treated equally.
Right.
A brain like that could have done so much more, but he was able to communicate that in a way that everyone understood the basic concept of fairness. And then he was also ultimately a man who was killed for that, right? I think that the reason America celebrates him the way they do is because he was about peaceful protests, and that also falls into line with a lot of the things that we want people to do. But the important parts of his legacy are often overlooked. He was about economic justice as well, and people don't discuss that. He was hugely radical for the time he lived in. This was a man that was stabbed, stoned, and then eventually shot. So I think he's worth celebrating because he put his life on the line. He put his whole being into something that he could have probably been a successful person without that, and he did that for all these people to understand, and he did it in such an effective way. So I definitely think he's one of the greatest Americans we know of.
Well, I agree. And, in addition to just fostering a more just and fair society, if I look at it just even purely selfishly, it's not, I don't think in anybody's best interest to have a group of people or various groups of people so marginalized that they don't feel like they can get ahead, that they don't have hope. And because that is invariably going to manifest itself somehow. And the more we can avoid that, the better.
Agreed. Definitely agreed. Yeah.
All right, we're running pretty close to the edge here. One last thing I wanted to ask you about was the mass media and the perception that is out there. We talked a couple of days ago about The Wire, which is a really hard look at America's inner cities. It really drove home the lack of opportunity and the challenge of upward mobility in those types of environments. You mentioned that you had seen that show. What did you think of that depiction of the inner city experience?
I thought it was brilliant. I thought it was interesting, the interactions between the various different components. Like every season looks at media versus politics versus education, and how that all plays into the being. A part of it is, as far as the depiction and the lack of opportunity, it reminded me of Malcolm X, again, the autobiography of Malcolm X, because in that book he talks about when he was in Harlem and he knew all these hustlers and like these guys who if given the opportunity, they would have been great businessmen, great mathematicians, great this. And you can kind of see that in The Wire, when you look at some of these guys that are like, there's like a Stringer Bell, or, you know, these guys would have been great minds put to something else had they been given the opportunity. So it's a very harsh depiction, obviously, of Baltimore and the drug trade and everything else, but it also speaks to there's talent everywhere, and and usually it finds its way to different types of opportunities depending on where it's at. And that's something for us to consider. How much talent are we throwing away collectively as a society based on subpar school systems, based on arbitrary distinctions? And yeah, it's unknown loss.
Well, we're wrapping up. Coming close to 10:30. Is there anything else that we haven't covered that you think people need to know about? How best to get a hold of the NAACP, how they can get involved, small or large steps that people can take to
Sure, yeah.
help at this critical time?
Yeah, you can reach us. We're at fairfaxnaacp.org. You can find us on Facebook at Fairfax NAACP. We also have a Twitter. You know, they can support our call for police reform in Fairfax County. Get involved with us as members if you'd like. Like I said, I have a website now, sean-perryman.com, where, you know, if you need help with anti-racism, like implementing into your own business, happy to help with that. But there's lots of ways to get involved, and there's lots of ways to stay engaged. And so I would encourage people to do that, because this is going to be an ongoing struggle. It's not going to be something, these things didn't happen overnight, and we're not going to change them overnight. It's going to take continued engagement.
Okay, well said. All right, Sean Perryman, president of the Fairfax County chapter of the NAACP. A fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for your openness and your insights. It is truly appreciated. I want to remind everybody that they can learn more about DemBiz by visiting our website at dembiz.org. We will continue to be hosting these pre-webinars during this COVID-19 crisis to not only engage the business community, but also hopefully achieve better understandings on issues like this. We talked about healthcare a couple weeks back, and we're going to have more forums and programs like this. So thank you for joining us. It is greatly appreciated. We invite you to become a member by visiting our website, and we will talk to you again soon. Thanks, Sean.
Thank you. Bye-bye.